is inevitable. War is tragic. There's no way that the USA knew for sure that 10 years ago they were setting us on a path towards war with Russia. Hello there, you 5.7 million awakening wonders. Thank you for joining me on this limitless odyssey towards truth. We wage war against deception together. Holy warriors of light, crusaders for peace, jihadists for unifying glory. No matter where you're from, no matter what you've been through, no matter what you've believed up till now, surely you're beginning to understand that community, coming together, finding new alliances so that we can confront centralized corruption wherever we find it is the only solution available to us now. And it's the solution we have to pursue. I spoke to the journalist Aaron Maté. He's an award-winning journalist. He explained to me that 10 years ago, America were aware that the course of action they were undertaking with regard to Ukraine was likely to lead to war. Inevitable, almost. Have a listen to Aaron Maté. He makes this complex situation understandable. He makes conspiracy theories conspiracy fact by doing the research. Are you sick and tired of being called a conspiracy theorist yet? Are you beginning to realize that you simply understand things that have been previously concealed? Stay to the end of this video. It's a very important conversation, and in the comments let me know what you think about it. How much do you think the American government games out the likelihood of there, for example, being a massive nuclear war?
The US has known at the highest levels for more than a decade exactly where this would lead. The warning came from Joe Biden's current director of the CIA, William Burns. In 2008, he was the US ambassador to Russia. And he wrote a long memo that we know of thanks to WikiLeaks that was released among the diplomatic cables of the US, warning that for the entire Russian establishment, the US policy of trying to turn Ukraine into a NATO proxy on Russia's borders was a red line. It doesn't matter whether you're Vladimir Putin or the most bitter opponents of Vladimir Putin, everybody in Russia saw Ukraine's membership into NATO as a red line. And that's because Ukraine has deep historical ties to Russia. And there are millions of people inside Ukraine who speak Russian, who identify with Russia. And so trying to turn a country with such a, diverse population, people who loathe Russia and people who want to be a part of Russia, was a recipe for disaster. And William Burns wrote this memo warning that if the US pursues this policy of trying to bring Ukraine into NATO, then that could one day lead to civil war, which would force Russia to intervene on its own side. This was warned about by William Burns in 2008. The Bush administration got that warning, didn't care. They announced that same year that Ukraine and Georgia would be one day admitted to NATO. That was a declaration formalized at a NATO summit. And the US has been pursuing that policy ever since. And so that then led to the incident I talked about earlier, the 2014 Maidan coup, in which a president, Yanukovych, who didn't want to choose one side, he actually was trying to play both sides. He wanted to have friendly ties with Russia and with the US. That wasn't good enough for the US, who saw Ukraine as the biggest prize, as the head of the National Endowment for Democracy said. So they fomented this coup, and that led to the outbreak of this war. So the US has known where this has led. And I guess part of it is an imperial hubris. I don't think they fully realized that Russia would one day finally retaliate and go to the extraordinary step of invading. I personally didn't think Russia would do it, but certainly they've known from the highest levels that this was a danger, and they just didn't care. They just didn't care. And I think that speaks to the arrogance that comes from thinking that you run the world.
Once you find yourself in this as you call it, once this imperialist hubris leads to that kind of reaction, which is now, of course, popularly ascribed to Putin's own imperialism, and I always have to be careful because of the nature of our platform to say that I don't advocate for Putin, and I don't even want to contradict the aspects of the dominant narrative that Putin and his own intentions are pretty malign. But now that we find ourselves in this position, given that by your reckoning, they did not anticipate a military response, does that mean now that they are potentially not anticipating a further, perhaps more radical military response? Or do you think that the geopolitical stasis is held together by the old 1980s ideas such as mutual deterrent? Do you think that there's a real risk of a nuclear war, or do you think this is hyperbole? And how do you imagine that the people that make the decisions that lead us into this kind of position regard that terrifying possibility?
Well, thankfully, and Noam Chomsky has pointed this out, that there is a restraining force inside the US government, and that is the Pentagon. the Pentagon knows the consequences of fueling a proxy conflict with Russia. They know it leads to nuclear war. And that's why the Pentagon has made very, very clear from the start of Russia's invasion that US forces are not going to be involved. It's crazy that we have to rely on the Pentagon, of all people, for some sanity. But unfortunately, there are people inside the Biden White House and the State Department who just don't think these things through. And I think they're too captivated by hegemonic thinking to be able to weigh properly the consequences of their actions. And, you know, the tragedy of all this is that this didn't have to happen. Since 2015 in Ukraine, there's been something called the Minsk Accords. And that was basically a deal brokered by France and Germany. And the bargain was that the war in eastern Ukraine would end. The rebels there who rose up in 2014 would lay down their arms. And in return, they'd be granted some limited autonomy inside Ukraine, but Ukraine's borders would stay intact. So these Russian-speaking regions of Donetsk and Luhansk would stay within Ukraine's borders, just with some autonomy. And that autonomy meant, though, that these regions could essentially block Ukraine's membership to NATO. And that's presumably why the US has never lifted a finger to get Ukraine to implement the Minsk Accords. And the Ukrainian government, even though they've promised to implement it, they've done nothing also, because part of their problem is that Ukraine has a very strong far-right contingent. It's not like the majority of the population, but muscle-wise and military-wise, the Azov Battalion and other far-right movements have a lot of power. They helped bring the coup government to power in 2014. And every time there's been talk of trying to end the war in the Donbass and implementing the Minsk Accords, these far-right groups have essentially threatened to overthrow the government. And Zelensky, the current president, he was elected with a huge mandate to end the war, to make peace. More than 70% of the vote. Big mandate. People on both sides of the Ukraine civil war voted for him. We're very, very optimistic about it. But he was powerless because the far right was threatening literally to kill him if he implemented Minsk. And he got no support at all from the US. The US essentially sided with Ukraine's far right. And so I think, luckily, there are people inside the Pentagon who know that this could lead to nuclear war and thus will act as a restraining force. But why are we even making this a remote possibility? It speaks to the insanity of the people who run our world. There's a total lack of morality evident in the kind of this decision-making process, isn't there? Because if you had a sort of a true an ethical value system that was authentic, you'd say we can't back this far-right group in order simply to have our own interests met. There's such plasticity in the pursuit of the foreign goals of the US that it will inevitably lead to these kind of conflicts and these kind of contradictions. So there's a few things, Aaron. One, the pledge for $40 billion in assistance. How much of that will end up being sort of processed by Raytheon and Lockheed Martin? How much of that $40 billion of aid will just end up being weapon industry stuff rather than troops being comfortable or whatever it is, or aid reaching people? And are there, and aside from the strategic gains of destabilizing Russia, are there any implicit energy gains that are in any way related to the sort of the pre-existing Hunter-Biden relationship, for example? Are there any? Is that a kind of, I don't know, a tip of an iceberg of any kind? Does that reveal anything else about this conflict? Absolutely, there is an energy component to this. Before the Russian invasion, a major project of the U.S. establishment, from Donald Trump to Joe Biden, was to cancel something called the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. The Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, which was a new pipeline being built that would bring Russian energy faster to Germany and the rest of Europe. And the problem from the point of view of U.S. planners with this pipeline was that not only would it increase the flow of Russian energy to Europe and take away a market for the US, also it would just deepen integration between Russia and the rest of Europe, and thus make conflict and sanctions more difficult. Because if you're sharing energy, it's a lot harder to start a war and to cut off Russia from the rest of Europe with sanctions. So Trump tried very hard to kill this pipeline, which is ironic because during the same period, the obsession here in the US was that he was really secretly doing Vladimir Putin's bidding. And Biden essentially has done the same, although he backed it off a little bit initially. But right before the invasion, he was trying to really force Germany into pledging to cancel Nord Stream 2, which Germany ultimately did. And now Germany is feeling the consequences of that with higher energy prices and the threat of going without heat next winter. And so the US has succeeded there. And meanwhile, they stand to gain because this means that they can sell their liquefied natural gas, which instead of sending it via a pipeline from Germany to Russia, which are pretty close to each other, has to be shipped across the ocean from the US, which is crazy, but that's profitable for the US. So what does the US government care about that?
Well, do you feel a little bit cleverer? Do you feel a bit better informed? Do you think you'll be able to have conversations with your friends, your pals, your family that have swallowed the mainstream gruel and hit them with some facts? You've got some backup now. You'll be able to attack lovingly, of course, and put them back on track so that they understand a little better, even though it's difficult, isn't it, to take on the job of trying to explain people truth in a world that's full of a miasma of deception and lies. But you can do it. I believe in you. If you enjoyed this video, please watch either one of these. They're both fantastic videos. Please give the video a thumbs up. Turn on the notification bell. Get that notification bell. Have it ding-a-ling-a-ling-ing in your mind like you got tinnitus, because we need to stay connected to you always. To be sure of that, sign up to my mailing list right now. Stay free.